Greek mythology has a story about a man named Procrustes, also known as the Stretcher. He would invite travelers to spend the night at his house, where he would make them lay down on his iron bed and try to fit them all into that same bed. If the traveler would be short, Procrustes would tie their limbs to the bed with a rope and stretch them to make them fit the bed. If the guest proved too tall, he would amputate the excess length. This story is of particular interest to us because the compulsory public education system that exists today in our societies can be said to be Procrustean in nature, as it does something very similar. It takes a wide spectrum of children from different social, economic, and intellectual backgrounds and throws them together haphazardly in the same classroom with the aim, by hook or by crook, to make them as uniform, as standardized as possible. They're made to compete against each other when they could benefit a lot more from working together. They're made to follow the same routine, taught the same curriculum, and given the same tests so that they can be prepared for the same careers. Bertrand Russell noted in his 1952 book, The Impact of Science on Society, how school education is designed to work against the student. He wrote, "Education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable, throughout the rest of their lives, of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished." He continues about how in the future, diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Even if all are miserable, all will believe themselves happy, because the government will tell them that they are so. So, as often as we might hear how we need to fix our schools, that they don't fulfill their purpose, truth be told, the compulsory school system, as it was built, does exactly what it was designed for. It is a model of social engineering, meant to take kids away from their parents at an early age, so that they may be programmed to be subordinate pieces in a hierarchy of control. Education is used in schools just as it pretends to make this pyramid of social order seem inevitable. As educator John Taylor Gatto points out, school is a 12-year jail sentence where bad habits are the only curriculum truly learned. But that raises a few questions. Where and how did the system of compulsory education start? How did it spread? And if school is so bad for children, for society at large, why and how does it continue to exist? To answer that, we need a history lesson that is almost never taught in school. The desire for a compulsory system of education is not recent. Plato, the Greek philosopher, over 2,000 years ago, wrote in his Republic about a system that takes possession of children and puts them through compulsory education since an early age to protect them from being corrupted by the habits of their parents. But although the powers that be had long imagined a system of compulsory education through which the youth of a nation can be controlled and prepared, one of the first widespread implementations of such a system came in the late 18th and 19th century in the Kingdom of Prussia. The Prussian army had just faced defeat at the hands of France, and a need was felt on the national level to discipline and condition children so that they could be prepared into well-armed and obedient soldiers. Laws were brought into place and the Prussian model of education was set up, with mandatory attendance for all young citizens from the age of 5 to 14, a prescribed national curriculum, and national testing for all students. In his book, The Prussian Elementary Schools, Thomas Alexander wrote the following in the year 1919. "We believe, however, that a careful study of the Prussian school system will convince any unbiased reader that the Prussian citizen cannot be free to do and act for himself, that the Prussian is, to a large measure, enslaved through the medium of his school, that his learning, instead of making him his own master, forges the chain by which he is held in servitude. That the whole scheme of Prussian elementary education is shaped with the express purpose of making 95 out of every 100 citizens subservient to the ruling house and to the state. John Taylor Gatto, in his book The Underground History of American Education, describes how the Prussians held a clear idea of what centralized schooling should deliver: obedient soldiers to the army, obedient workers for mines, factories, and farms, well-subordinated civil servants trained in their function, well-subordinated clerks for industry, citizens who thought alike on most issues, and national uniformity in thought, word, and deed. To say that the system was effective would be an understatement. Governments and empires around the globe started looking at the Prussian model as a means to strengthen their hold over their territories and control over their populace. And soon enough, the Prussian system was widely adopted across Europe. How the Prussian model took hold in the United States is an even interesting story. The success of the Prussian education system in Prussia and Austria was of particular interest to many educational philosophers in the United States who were devoted to developing educational philosophy for their own nation. By the mid-19th century, many of these philosophers, educators, or politicians, including Horace Mann, who at the time was a member of the United States Congress and had previously served as secretary of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, had traveled to Germany to see the Prussian system in action. By the time they returned, they were already advocating intensely for the system to be implemented in the United States. Following on these recommendations, Governor Edward Everett of Massachusetts instituted a mandatory education policy based on the Prussian system. Now, the official account might state that this transformation was embraced by the public with open arms, but that couldn't be further away from the truth, as the government mandates on mandatory schooling were opposed with fierce resistance, as people recognized that public schooling had little to do with education and more with control. But it was not only the government that sought to exploit the Prussian system. Industrialists also saw how such a system would help them create a more obedient workforce. One such example is the Carnegie credit system, named after the 19th century industrialist Andrew Carnegie. As John Taylor Gatto describes in the ultimate history lesson, there were no pensions for teachers, as the government didn't set up the pension system. Carnegie set up the pension system out of his own pocket, and of course, they didn't give it to everybody. Your school had to conform with what they said was a balanced educational diet. You could compete for the pensions if you followed the Carnegie credit system. Is there any school in the country who didn't? I've never heard of one. And how couldn't you? To understand better why governments and industrialists found the Prussian or the factory model of schooling so useful, we must go back to the classrooms they've all been in and dissect what really goes on inside of them. At first glance, a classroom may look unremarkable, but as they say, the devil truly is in the details. Closer observation would reveal how Prussian schooling, which was designed to kill creativity and imagination, is implemented in classrooms and curriculums to slowly disable the synthesizing power of the mind and disarm children of any critical thinking. In his speech, The 7-Lesson School Teacher, John Taylor Gatto precisely describes the 7 aspects of the hidden curriculum of mandatory schooling. Number 1. Confusion. Even in the best schools, a close examination of curriculum and its sequences turns up a lack of coherence, a host of internal contradictions. Everything taught inside of classrooms is out of context. It is unrelated, disconnected, and more than a child can or needs to absorb. From geography and history to computer languages and architectural drawing, the various subjects in the curriculum have nothing to do with each other. But since children have no words to define the panic and anger they feel because of this consistent rain of pre-decided facts by experts they have no relation with, everything is allowed to pass, and students must accept confusion as their destiny. Number 2. Class position. students must stay in the class where they belong. The children are numbered so that if any get away, they can be returned to the right class. The lesson of numbered classes is that everyone has a proper place in the pyramid, and that there is no way out of your class. You must stay where you are put. Number 3, indifference. Children must not care too much about anything. When the bell rings, they shall drop whatever it is they have been doing and proceed quickly to the next workstation, since no work is worth finishing. They must turn on and off like a light switch at the commands of their masters. Bells are the secret logic of school time. Their logic is inescapable, as bells destroy the past and the future, rendering every interval the same as any other, as the abstraction of a map renders every living mountain and river the same, even though they are not. Up next, we have emotional dependency. By stars and red checks, smiles and frowns, prizes, honors and disgraces, kids are taught to surrender their will to the predestinated chain of command. Rights may be granted or withheld by any authority without appeal, because rights do not exist inside a school unless school authorities say they do. Individuality, which is constantly trying to assert itself among children and teenagers, is a contradiction of class theory, a curse to all systems of classification, and so it must be curbed at all costs, which is followed by intellectual dependency. Good students wait for a teacher to tell them what to do. This is the most important lesson of them all. We must wait for other people, better trained than ourselves, to make the meanings of our lives. The expert makes all the important choices. Only the teacher can determine what the kids must study, or rather, only the people who pay the teachers can make those decisions, which the teachers then enforce. This power to control what children will think lets teachers separate successful students from failures very easily. Bad kids fight this, of course, even though they lack the concepts to know what they are fighting. Fortunately, there are tested procedures to break the will of those who resist. Number 6. Provisional self-esteem. The factory model of schooling understands that our world wouldn't survive a flood of confident people very long. So kids are taught that their self-respect should depend on expert opinion. For this, they are constantly evaluated and judged. A monthly report is sent into every student's home to produce approval or mark exactly, down to a single percentage point, how dissatisfied with the child a parent should be. Good schooling, just like consumerism and capitalism, depends on perpetuating dissatisfaction. Children are compelled to disregard self-evaluation and arrive at certain decisions about themselves and their futures based on the casual judgment of strangers. The lesson of report cards, grades, and tests is that people need to be told what they are worth, and so children should not trust themselves or their parents, but should instead rely on the evaluation of certified officials. And lastly, number 7, one cannot hide. Students are taught that they are always watched, that each is under constant surveillance by the authorities. There are no private spaces for children. There is no private time. When bells sound and classes change, students should proceed to the next workstation instead of socializing with their peers. To make matters worse, students are encouraged to snitch on each other, or even to snitch on their own parents. And of course, parents too are encouraged to file reports about their own child's disobedience, thus creating a family trained to snitch on itself so that no dangerous secrets are concealed. An extended type of schooling, called homework, is assigned so that the effect of surveillance, if not the surveillance itself, travels into private households, where students might otherwise use free time to learn something unauthorized from their parents by exploration or by apprenticing to some wise person in the neighborhood. As would be clear by now, the purpose of Prussian education, or what we can call as modern education, is to remove individuality and self-reliance, making children self-amputate their curiosity so that they can grow into adults who are hopeless and simply accept their position in the social hierarchy. When every child, on the account of being uniquely different from one's peers, needs a unique curriculum, The factory model of education strives to condition everyone to be as similar as is possible so that they can be classified and controlled. So, needless to say, something needs to change. But what exactly? Martin Luther said in the 16th century that no one needed the Pope's indulgence in order to receive the forgiveness of sins. Redemption could be obtained by each man at his prayers in the privacy of his own bedchamber, for every man is his own priest. While those remarks were religiously oriented, in the secular world of today, modern education has replaced our religions, as just like any religious organization, it requires its teachings to be accepted on faith. And so, these words can very aptly be applied to the school system. Children don't need certified experts who feed them a pre-decided curriculum and then judge and grade them based on their performance in memorizing those set of facts. True education comes from freedom, not coercion. Another set of statements that was based on religious choice but can be applied to educational freedom comes from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "Reason and experiment have been indulged, and error has fled before them. It is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. Subject opinion to coercion. Whom will you make your inquisitor? Fallible men, men governed by bad passions, by private as well as public reasons. And why subjected to coercion? To produce uniformity. But is uniformity desirable? Introduce the bed of Procrustes then, and as there is danger that the large men may beat the small, make us all of a size, by lopping the former and stretching the latter. Difference of opinion is advantageous. A great analogy here would be of fleas enclosed in a jar. Initially, the fleas are filled with energy, and they keep attempting to follow their own agenda, striking themselves over and over again against the lid and the walls of the jar. But if you just let them be, after a certain time, they get all huddled in a mass together. Now, when you take the lid off, they don't even try to escape. This is the effect of the Prussian model of education on children. We all say little babies are always curious. Well, one good way to destroy curiosity is to sit people in chairs, organize their lives to the sound of bells, tell them to speak only when spoken to, threaten them with upcoming tests, ask them to memorize usually erroneous material, and give them homework so that they keep working on what you want them to do even when they are out of your reach. As John Taylor Gatto notes, no one believes anymore that scientists are trained in science classes, or politicians in civics classes, or poets in English classes. The truth is that schools don't really teach anything except how to obey orders. Although teachers do care and do work very, very hard, the institution is psychopathic. It has no conscience. It rings a bell and the young man in the middle of writing a poem must close his notebook and move to a different cell where he must memorize the humans and monkeys derived from a common ancestor. It's time we understand that schooling and education are two very different things. The institutions we have today are intended to produce, through the application of formulas, formulaic human beings whose behavior can be predicted and controlled. It's time we realize that we don't need more schooling, we need less. Or as John Taylor Gatto puts it in his book, Dumbing Us Down, what to do? Encourage and underwrite experimentation. Trust children and families to know what's best for themselves. Stop the segregation of children and the aged in walled compounds. Involve everyone in every community in the education of the young. Businesses, institutions, all people, whole families. Look for local solutions and always accept a personal solution in place of a corporate one. You need not fear educational consequences. Reading, writing, and arithmetic aren't very hard to teach if you take the pains to see that compulsion and the school agenda don't short-circuit each individual's private appointment with themselves to learn these things. There is abundant evidence that less than 100 hours is sufficient for a person to become totally literate and a self-teacher. Don't be panicked by scare tactics into surrendering your children to experts.